This is our weekly 51st episode of Stopping the Crime and Violence in America. And we've had a lot of different kinds of shows, a lot about gun violence, and we've had people from all different sectors of society that have joined us. And I want to send a special welcome to one of our speakers who we did not welcome yet. He has just joined us. So welcome, welcome. One second, I have to get myself set up here. Darlene is with us. We know that we've had many different kinds of programs. We did have a really different one with Native Americans, which was, I think, very shocking for all of us. We learned a lot of statistics that we had no idea about. Today is like that again. We're going to have a very different program dealing with domestic violence. So I think that, everybody here is very interested and has learned a lot over this past year. And we're very pleased to have two wonderful ladies with us. If I can find Darlene. Oh, there she is. Hi, Darlene.
Hello.
We will put you on a spotlight here and get rid of me. Remove and put Darlene on. I'm sorry, guys. There we go. Oh, you're in your car. Oh my goodness.
I am. I just ran from a conference presentation right out to my car so that
yes,
I could talk to you about domestic violence. Yeah.
Thank you so much. And her associate is Diane. I'd like to tell you a little bit about both these ladies, and then they can just tag team and let us know all about the wonderful work that they're doing. Darlene Thomas is executive director at Greenhouse 17, which was formerly called Bluegrass Domestic Violence Program, and same with Diane, although Diane is an associate director. Darlene, Greenhouse 17 is an advocacy agency committed to ending domestic abuse in families in the community, and they'll speak about services provided by the agency, including a 24-hour hotline, 42-bed emergency shelter, legal advocacy, and more. Darlene has worked as an advocate for families for, is it 33 years or 23?
33 and counting.
Yes, because it said 23, but I knew that you had mentioned 33, so I thought I'd change it. She was the executive director, like I mentioned, of the Bluegrass Domestic Violence Program before it was changed to Greenhouse 17 in Lexington, Kentucky, but has been fortunate to have served in multiple advocacy roles across the Commonwealth of Kentucky. They're from Kentucky, Son Willett's friends. Darlene has trained and educated community professionals regarding the uses of domestic violence regarding the issues of domestic violence locally, statewide, nationally, and internationally. And I'd like to introduce Diane too. She's currently the assistant director of Greenhouse 17, formerly the Bluegrass Domestic Violence Program. It's a nonprofit advocacy agency in the Bluegrass region of Kentucky committed to ending domestic violence and intimate partner abuse in families and the community. Diane's focus is working on developing, I don't know if I'm saying this right, best practices for trauma-informed residential programming for victims of domestic violence. Is that correct? Did I say it correct?
It sounded fabulous. Yes.
Okay.
That's what we're doing.
All right. That centers around a 40-acre working farm. Her first 10 years were spent in the criminal justice system, overseeing the Office of Fayette County Sheriff's Victim Service Division. So I'm going to let you ladies have the floor. Please tell us what's going on. We're really interested to know, and then best practices and solutions and, hope for the future.
Sounds great. I was sort of a little bit of a replacement in case Darlene was not going to be available to speak. So as traditional of a lot of our relationships, I'm going to let her lead, and I'm really great at interjecting if something really kind of stands out to me or sticks up to me. The only thing I'm just going to quickly say is I'm so glad you're talking about domestic violence when you're talking about violence in the community. I think it's an area that often gets overlooked. And I think if you dig deep, you will see roots of domestic violence playing out a lot in our communities and our families, both in the abusers and in our survivors. And I think we don't dig far enough down to try to do some intervention work with domestic violence that I think could really help in a preventative piece for crime response and violence response and gun violence in our communities. So thank you for bringing this to the table. And Darlene, I'm going to be quiet and then I'll
Well,
just join
well,
in.
you don't have to. We can join in. And anytime anybody has questions, I hope you will just pipe in and do that. I like to have the informal discussion and dialogue because it's a complex subject. It's not anything that can be, tackled in an hour in fullness in the sense. But I will agree with Diane that I think there's touchstones of family violence, intimate partner violence in almost every other social problem that we have taking place in our country as a result. So, I think it's all interconnected and interrelated. So you cannot deal with certain forms without dealing often with the core form that many people experience. And that's, intimate partner violence or growing up in a home where there was intimate partner violence in that home. We do know that it's prevalent, it's epidemic, it's pandemic, if you want to use that language. For the issue of intimate partner violence, it's affects 1 in 3 specifically female survivors, about 1 in 5 to 6 male individuals that have experienced some form of intimate partner violence. So it's prevalent, and it's so thank you very much for hosting us and being willing to talk about maybe how you address that, how you look and help survivors and understand that survivors are multifaceted. They come with many parts. They might be a survivor of intimate partner violence, but they also had childhoods and families and histories and other relationships and, beliefs and faith and work life, all the things that we all have. And then you add on to that this overwhelming burden many times of this violence within the relationship. It's verbal and emotional, mental. It takes many forms, as well as sexual violence that many people are enduring and facing. So for our organization, Greenhouse 17 has worked to have a really unique perspective of how we serve survivors that come to us for help. And there's some of the core services that you mentioned, such as going to court with people so they don't have to walk that journey alone. We, provide individual case management, counseling, support groups. We have housing programs and housing support to try to stabilize the family if they've left one situation or trying to end the abusive relationship but need a house to stabilize themselves or housing support to do that. So our job is really to take every individual and meet them where they are with their needs, whatever that looks like, and try to be that fill that gap from self-sufficient, from crisis, when they're in crisis, to self-sufficiency. That's really our goal. And we do it in a variety of ways, which are traditional, and then we do it in a lot of non-traditional ways. So our shelter is very non-traditional. It actually, the shelter part of what we do sits on a 40-acre horse farm. Not very many domestic violence programs have that kind of land or acreage. It's definitely a rural setting. We serve 17 community or counties in central Kentucky. So we have a very large service area beyond Lexington itself. But most of who we serve are rural survivors. They are people that aren't necessarily from large cities or the larger communities. They're coming from small communities, and being on a 40-acre farm has really been helped create an inclusion for them where they feel safe and comfortable because it's what's known and familiar versus having to go into a city. So we're on this farm, and I'm going to let Diane talk about it. We'll just tag team because some of this is her baby. You all need to know Diane and I have been together since the beginning. I was hired to start a new organization in this community. 18 years ago. I thought I would be here 7 or 8. And it's been 18 years ago. And the very first person I hired was Diane Fleet to be the associate director. And we have been together ever since, and the only leaders of this organization since its existence. So Diane is one of those really creative souls, and we were providing shelter, emergency shelter. We have a 42-bed facility. We do all kinds of services day in and day out to meet victims where they are, help themselves, help their children, because children live with us as well, when people are fleeing and needing a space. So we do all that all the time. And then about, I don't know, how long has it been now, Diane? 12 years, 10 years ago, we kind of hit, it was a financially more difficult time in the U.S. and for us locally. And there was a whole sense of, buy local, take care of your own, keep it in Kentucky, like all your money, your resources, those kind of things. And we were struggling trying to find some of our own identity and how we communicate with the community, as well as help survivors take the next steps once they've left a violent relationship. And Diane worked with some community groups, and I'll let her tell you a little bit about our innovation that the organization has received much knowledge and recognition about, and kind of people seek us out of what we're doing that's a lot differently. And that would be the farm and food and hospitality, like a whole different way to not just treat the human, but look at how you support the whole human that comes to you. And that is much bigger than the issue of domestic violence. There are many other needs: sense of belonging, a sense of purpose, a sense of knowing they have worth and value. And that doesn't just come from living in a shelter and us talking to people. It has to be more. And so Diane was real creative and started our industries, and I'll let her tag team and tell you all what that looks like for us. How's that?
That sounds good. So I think just to step back just a teeny bit, Darlene did mention it. So we have men, women, and children that live at Greenhouse 17. Certainly it is primarily women, some single, some that bring their children with them. And I think as she was saying, there was a lot of conversation at the moment of food deserts, food justice, access to the outdoors. We were seeing a lot of information coming from veterans returning back from active duty. We were also seeing the trauma that people were experiencing that were confined and in jails and in prison. And we were seeing that nature, animal husbandry, like lots of things were sort of really contributing to people's wellness. And we thought, the experience of survivors of intimate partner violence also is that daily kind of walking on eggshells. You really never quite know what's going on in that house. You're constantly having to, respond to a person's power over you and control over you. And so we thought there's a lot of similarities here, and not having control of your life. And so we knew people just coming out to the farm before it was even a farm, there was just sort of a safety. There was a release. There was I never thought I would live in a place like this, just being outdoors. And I think we were even seeing some work like that in hospitals. People that had access to looking outdoors and seeing nature or music actually healed better. So some people just on a side note were sort of gathering a lot of wellness and care and healing around that. But then we started working as far as the farm goes, and we did some work with the University of Kentucky, hoping to get that research back soon to see if people who did work outdoors intentionally actually had different kind of wellness points that were different from folks that were at Greenhouse 17 that really just were here but didn't intentionally work with a farm. And from that, we have a flower CSA where we grow flowers. We sell weekly subscriptions. The women help participate in that. They grow, they pick, they harvest, they arrange. From that, we've done some products. So we sell soaps and candles and lip balms. And again, the women help create and market and go to pop-up shops to help sell that. And then we also have Finley, who's in our kitchen, and we have a kitchen garden for people that can help grow those vegetables and bring them into shelter, because we knew nutrition and diet and health was a really critical piece that was often overlooked for people who had been experiencing domestic violence. All of that, I think, was a fabulous thing. I will tell you, one of the more difficult pieces is it was critical to us, and I really learned this a great deal from Darlene, when you can build structure in a program, but you always have to give the power back to the families that are here. And so it would be easy to come in with a lot of rules, and this is the expectation, and this is what we need to do, and this is when we go out to the farm, and this is when we do our chores, and this is when we eat our dinner, and these things. And I have to say, when I came into this work, I had this idea of creating this space, and I thought, as I was learning from her and learning this work in community living, giving power back to the families is really one of the most important pieces that you can do. So for folks that are listening in, as you begin to assess and evaluate in whatever field you're in, to see if domestic violence has impacted the folks that you're working with on a micro or a macro level, it's always important that you're making sure that the program bends to the families and the folks that you're serving, and not that they need to bend to you, because we don't want to replicate the control patterns of the abusive person. The goal is to constantly give decision-making and authority, if that's the right word, but recognize their own expertise of where they want their life to go. And that can be really difficult, because in a shelter setting, we know a lot of people's experience with domestic violence, and sometimes we have really unhealthy coping mechanisms. So we might have some depression, anxiety, and whether it's mental health or just the impact of ongoing long-term trauma and PTSD sometimes is not the best with decision making. We also know we might have some substance use for coping. And so how do we make sure that people that have been trying to survive, that we're not taking away their support system of shelter and advocacy because they're actively using, or because they're actively, in mental health crisis. So a lot of partnerships and a lot of relationships with outside entities, to hopefully that we keep people in shelter, and again, as safe as possible, but also the families that are with them, because we're often on different kind of healing journeys. But it's something that I think has really been a struggle all along, but I will say that it's worth the effort to definitely do that, and not come in a punitive space or an overly rigid space, but to really adapt to it. And that's been, I think, I shifted to that because that's been a little bit of the difficulty of the farm. We're in some degrees trying to run a business, but we got to run a business that is really beneficial to the families that are working it, and not to the point that it's so difficult of a task that they're unable to. We want it to be a success. We want their interaction to always be positive, always building, always supportive. So love the farm, and I love the engagement that the farm gives, but just really recognizing that in domestic violence, intimate partner violence, that it can be a little bit of a population that has had such such dignity and control taken away from them, that we constantly have to keep feeding that back to the families, which slows the process down, but it's a better end result, I think. So I'm going to pause at that. Darlene, did that lead you anywhere?
No, not really. It's perfect. You did great as always. I think, I don't know exactly what people want to know or what would most benefit them. So is there an avenue for people to ask questions, or?
Oh yeah,
Because,
definitely.
I've been doing DV work for 33 years, so we can ask a whole lot of,
and I do,
when it comes to survivors and
and
how
I
to
do,
help them and serve.
Yeah, and I do know, before you came on, I was talking with Nadia a little bit. I do think that a little bit of that, I think folks around here, a little bit of the pervasiveness of domestic violence. So not to ramble off statistics, but this is not something that is happening to very few people. That domestic violence impacts a lot of our population and community. If you want to chat about that, I know that was an interest.
Can I interject a little bit here?
Sure.
Hey, I have, it says in an interview that you two have done a lot of talking to people, and I looked up several of your interviews that you've done. According to the National Coalition Against Domestic Violence, Kentucky, I'm sorry to speak to bring Kentucky under the spotlight, but I mean, it's everywhere. Kentucky has some of the highest domestic violence statistics. 45.3% of women, and you did address this earlier, and 35.5% of men have experienced domestic violence. In one day in 2019, Kentucky's domestic violence program served 1,000 in one day, 1,420 adults and child survivors, while another 128 requests went unmet due to a lack of resources. Also, so if you'd want to talk about that, and then also, I want to say something that really shocked me. Darlene, you in an interview, you said, to me, having done this work for over 33 years now, the violence has escalated. Not that it's not always been bad, but the right events, the calls are heavier, harder, a lot more. Listen to this, strangulations. I mean, you don't need a gun, you have the weapons on your body. Strangulations, attempted use of weapons. So I just wanted everyone to be aware of what these ladies are dealing with. And, you know, I think it's understandable to all of us that they're trying to help people to own their own healing, because they're the ones that need to live with themselves and their families every day. So thank you. You girls are like everybody's moms. We really appreciate you. And if you want to take off on some of the things that I just presented, or if there's questions from outside, feel free.
I would say a few things. I started with, it's a very complex issue, right? So you can't put any one survivor in a box and assume that we understand the fullness of their experience with their partner. I think why it's so hard for us, and I don't always get this world, and why it's so difficult to understand how people hurt people, because we get to see that every day. But I think what makes it so complex is most of us know people who have hurt people. Many times with intimate partner violence, we've seen that in our own homes, in our own households, in our own extended family, or our friendships, or our colleagues. So it touches us differently. And we need to recognize that just like survivors have a really hard time understanding that their own experience of what's happening to them, societally, you know, we have a hard time because we see a person often that looks like they're, you know, doing well. You know, they're the coach of the soccer team. They're, you know, a leader in the community. They are a police officer, or they were former military. All the batterers don't come with a big stamped forehead that says, I hurt my intimate partners. People who abuse and do harm are multifaceted. So we kind of like a lot of the who that they are, unless you were the one that had to live with them. And that's what I usually tell people. Like, batterers are very likable people normally. They're not what we want to think of as wearing tank tops and cowboy boots and a long criminal record. That's not factual for most survivors. Most survivors have never even called the police, had any kind of interaction with systems. They've avoided the systems. They've kept the secret. They've held the pain of what's happening to them. And so we, you know, visually want to look at it like it's this kind of person that does this kind of harm. And I think if we're going to be open to helping all survivors, we need to let go of our own bias and our thoughts about what this problem looks like. So, you know, I mean, I grew up not in a home where there was violence, but I had extended family members in my home that were at Thanksgiving dinners. Like, we all knew that this person treated their partner horribly. But we liked him. He was funny. He was kind. He would take us shopping when we were kids. Like, he had all these other wonderful qualities, but he also was hurtful. So in us evolving, I'm no longer a child, I'm an adult. And there's a way that we can understand that it's complex and that we do not have to accept. That doesn't mean that, well, we do not have to accept the use of violence and harm to other people. And as a community, we need to be able to talk about it. And so that the silence stops, so that the secrets stop. And whether that's from the pulpit, whether that's from your workplace, whether that's from you, wherever you have an audience, we need to be able to start to have this discussion so that survivors feel safe to tell their story, come forward, get the help, even if it's whatever that looks like for that family. Does that make sense to y'all? It's critical. And then you mentioned too, Nadia, the rate of violence. What you were quoting there was during COVID, and following COVID and the pandemic was horrific as far as violence. Just in the city of Lexington, we had 13 homicides in 1 year, mostly all gun violence. It was mostly gun violence that occurred for that to happen. And you could have combined the last 8 years together and you wouldn't have had 13 homicides in a town of Lexington. So COVID itself, where everybody said, stay home and be safe from COVID, the least safe place for a domestic violence victim is home. And they often didn't have anywhere to go. And you just saw an escalation of the power that their partners used over them to control them and maintain control. Just seemed to escalate off the charts because they didn't have access to schools or resources or agencies that were open, things like that. And there was a lot of miscommunication during that time. So people thought courts were closed or that police wouldn't respond and all of these other things that weren't necessarily true, just lots of misinformation. And we just saw a huge bump in not just homicides, but the types of violence and the rate by which violence was utilized in the intimate relationship. And Kentucky does rank a little higher than the rest of the country, but this is a nationwide issue. This is not just a Kentucky issue by any means, right? Like it's 1 in 4 in Kentucky, or 1 in 4 in the country, and 1 in 3 in Kentucky.
Right. Yeah. Right. Hey, Darlene, this was a question, and I'm going to kind of merge them. It was in the chat. But it said, is there a connection between perpetrators of abuse and these same persons having been abused as children? And the question up above also talks about, is there certain experiences of youth that might lead to domestic violence? And from that, should there be things that we're doing with youth that are in homes where there's domestic violence?
Well, Diane, you can speak to some of that too, but I will tackle that. It's not causal. So just because you're raised in a home where you've witnessed abuse or seen one of your parents harmed by the other parent and controlled does not necessarily make you an abuser. Years ago, we used to say, like, if you were a boy that grew up in a violent home, you would become an abuser. If you were a girl that was raised in a violent home, you'd become a victim. We now know the research has shown that is not accurate. Many people break these patterns and cycles. But when you look at what attributed to how they break those cycles, they were a little different. So it was talked about, right? Younger people were taught, educated, were given a name for what was happening in their household so that they can make a conscious decision to do it differently. B, for young men who were raised in a violent home, those that do not become abusive to their partners, the big factor for that to occur was in ownership. They related more to the victim, right? Or to the primary victim in that household. That is who they related to more. And they could say, I love my other parent, but they vocally would say, but I am not going to be like that parent. It was really critical, but the only way you can do that is you can see that there's a problem. So for young people, they need to be empowered, with knowledge, but not just knowledge about what to do or how to be different. Because I think often people just follow patterns of behavior just because that's what they've always known, and have not been empowered differently. And Diane and I both from the very beginning were engaged with a program that was born at the University of Kentucky called Green Dot. And Green Dot is a prevention model that works with youth. It was targeted originally towards college age students because of the rate of sexual violence on college campuses. And then it's just extended over the years, but it's a model that empowers children not to be able to do something about the violence they're seeing and do, right? So it wasn't just that it happens, it's what can you do about it? And can you? And if it's not happening to you, what can you do to help others? And Diane actually sits on their board, the National Board of Green Dots. So I'm going to let you talk about more of its fruition. But it was born at UK and now it's national and international. Dorothy Edwards, which is the founder, has done tremendous work with Green Dot. Diane, did I miss something in that?
No, I don't think you did. I mean, I think there's some really good models right now of bystander intervention. Green Dot is sort of dear to our heart because it was sort of birthed here in Lexington, and we know Dorothy, and it's gotten some really great research data behind it. They're doing a lot of work right now with the military, but I think, you know, one of the shifts of that train of thought is, and it's hard for, I'll speak for me, but it's probably hard for Darlene. We're so used to victim response, victim intervention, crisis line, court advocacy, shelter. And so it's a little bit of a shift of, but it's a necessary shift, trying to get upriver a little bit and getting folks to begin to see those signs of power and control and coercive control that might play out to be domestic violence. So you might not even know, but it doesn't look good. Like, I'm not liking the power dynamics. I'm not liking, one of the questions is also about, are you seeing a difference between people with active faith and faith community relationships versus those that are not? And I don't have any statistics around it, but I would almost answer it a little bit like Darlene just did. If you're in a faith community that is respectful and it does not have oppressive messaging or patriarchal messaging and has space for folks to live to their fullest, then I don't think you're seeing that. But I think if you're sending that stigma or that messaging that some people are less than and it's appropriate to have power over folks, then I think you might see it. But I really don't have specific data on that. I know it's an area we've looked at a little bit at Greenhouse. We have a woman actually who works with us. She's an ordained minister, and she does some support group work on faith and healing practices around faith. A lot of our women look to their faith for their support in their healing process. And it's ridiculous for us not to open that up and have conversations. But we also know some people have really been injured by their faith communities as well. So as all things, you have to just sort of look at the environment that the kids are in or the faith community is in. And again, what messaging are we giving people, the tools and the space and the recognition to question and to ask questions and to be supported and cared for and loved. And so I shifted, I guess, from Green Dot, but Green Dot also is, how are we showing up for people, and do we show that we care, and do we pay attention to behavior or words or actions that don't look healthy? And that's a responsibility of all of us.
Absolutely.
And
I'd like to, Darlene, you have something?
Well, I was just going to say, there's a lot of research, and you're right, there are other models, but in Kentucky, the research of Green Dot over a 5-year period of time in the high school settings showed a 60% reduction in violence against women in those schools that had Green Dot. So when we're talking about violence reduction, which I think seems to be the interest of this group, very much so. I mean, that's what we're looking for, is a reduction in physical violence, sexual violence, harm. Because if you're a child that experiences harm, it takes so much more to undo that damage in the long run. The survivors we're serving, very few of them, just woke up one day in a violent relationship. It has been an evolution. Many of them were hurt as children, or repeatedly hurt as children, or in dating relationships was their first experiences. And what you just see is this culmination of violence that survivors have had to endure, that begin to change your brain chemistry and how you think about the world, and how you navigate and mitigate. So for a lot of us, I think in society, we want to go, oh my gosh, if you're in a violent relationship, just leave. Just get out of there. Why would you ever put up with that? Why would you be so stupid to go back to it? Like we kind of have these assumptions, but if we are not, for those of us who are blessed not to have had a cumulative trauma repeatedly throughout your lifetime, or young adult experience and adult experience, it's a lot easier to have judgment about what we think people should be doing. When in the reality is we know that cumulative violence actually changes somebody's brain chemistry, much like ongoing substance use would change your brain chemistry about how you think. So that takes time and nurturing and understanding and empowerment, and voice from the communities that make sure they're constantly talking about the value, that all individuals have value and people do not deserve to be harmed or hurt. And it can never be your fault even if you're doing unhealthy things, you are not to blame for what somebody else physically or sexually does to you to do harm, if that makes sense. So,
Absolutely. I wanted to bring Ray McCready up because he asked a couple of really good questions, and I want him to use his own voice rather than just typing. Ray, have at her.
All right, thank you. Yeah, that was this is a surprise, but anyway, I'm very listening to the program, engaged. I did grow up in a household that there was violence. What I just wrote it. I think we're always going over and over these things in our minds. It's a long, long time ago because I just turned 70. But when I think of my dad, I think it was a situation. The violence was I had a stressed out dad who wasn't taking responsibility. He had a lot of issues from being in the war, World War II in that case. And my mom, his wife, was very frustrated with him and would let him know, but she stood 5'1", weighed about 100 pounds, and he was 5'7" and built like a tank. And yet I'm grateful that he would destroy things, but he didn't hit anybody. So, but actually, that's just a little of the personal background. But the first question I asked to Diane and Darlene, or in the chat, I should say, is I'm interested if you see, and I know this may not be, I see you're focused more on solutions, and I really appreciate that because I was looking at your website, and that's awesome because that's where we need to be. But I said I was interested if you see commonalities in the backgrounds of abusers, which would hopefully lead to programs for youth in schools or elsewhere to prevent the occurrence of domestic violence. So that was my question. And I don't even know if you guys go there. So if not, that's fine. Just say we don't go
Well,
there.
Green Dot, I think, covers a lot.
yes, but when the question is, are there commonalities of those that
Yep.
use violence, right? In many ways. So, so intimate partner violence is not specifically a gender issue. It absolutely happens across, and there are women who can use violence against their partners and things. But what you do see, the main commonality of those that perpetrate is that, at least in heterosexual relationships, they are male, right? That is the predominant background, the vast majority. When you look at actually power dynamics. So, I get a little, having done this work a really long time and work with both parties, by the way. I worked with batters for almost 3 years in the support group and those kind of things. And I found batters to be very respectful, accommodating, and in that very manipulative because, I think the common thing for a lot of the people who use violence is this manipulation of everybody else except their intimate partner violence. And not that they don't gaslight them quite a bit, they do. But they often appear as good people, and they are. I mean, there's so many ways. I would do domestic violence support groups for batters, right? For those that did harm, and literally, people go, "How do you do that?" And I go, "Oh my gosh!" I go walk in a room of 30 batters. They were all polite. They said, "Yes, ma'am," "No, ma'am," the whole 9 yards. But it wasn't me they were trying to control. It wasn't me. They had the vested interest in it. So that's what I need us to remember when we're like societal and we go, oh, but this person looks like a really good guy. They were funny. They were charming. They kind. They opened the door. They closed the door. They knew their manners. They never once threatened me. They never once. Now, there were a few that minimized and kind of used, some male privilege in that sense. It's my wife, my partner. You don't have a right to tell us what to do. So there was some arrogance sometimes, a little narcissism here and there. But overall, the difference is I was not the person they were vested in to control. And that's why it's very hard for victims to believe that we, community, our faith, our backgrounds, our colleagues, our friends will believe what's happening to us is because how that batterer presents himself or herself, if it's primary aggressor, to the outside world. Most all of violence is family only. There are those that do harm, who are very abusive in every aspect, maybe been in and out of jail, been in and out of trouble. But the vast majority of batterers are what's considered family only abusers. They do it within the context to have power and control over the family. It's not a broad spectrum. And they might be jerks in other ways somewhere out in the community, but for the most part, pretty functioning individuals overall. The other common thing that you're going to find is that you can't really stereotype them because they come from all walks of life and all backgrounds. So you can't stereotype them or have any presumptions. Most all abusive partners have very little mental health issues. There are those that have some character pathology, but many of them, the vast majority, do not have it. And you can escalate a little bit more if you were trying to kind of rein in what might be some commonalities. And you could look at law enforcement and the military giving us a higher level of per capita of people who use violence in their intimate partners, probably based a lot out of their own trauma as military and law enforcement that they deal with. So understanding that, trauma begets trauma, untreated trauma traumatizes, right? So a lot of times the batter's own untreated trauma, what they do with that is they do harm to others in that process. So I hope that answered your question a little bit.
Yeah, I can see it's acting out, as you said, Darlene, trauma begets trauma or untreated trauma, which is a big issue. There are a lot of people, we keep getting in successive wars and other situations, but I was very enlightened by what you and by what Diana said about the whole thing about power, the whole kind of a sick power thing going on there. Instead of honoring the spouse and seeing beyond their whatever their issue or their annoyance is and trying to focus on the positive, somehow it sounds like there's a twisting action going on there that's very unhealthy. Thank you.
And what we do see too that they're, oh, sorry, Diane.
No, go ahead.
No, what we also see too is that there's a difference in how people use violence, especially when we look at gender. Okay. So men use violence to have power and control. Women use violence in order to almost defend or hold what little power they have. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And so we also know that when women use power in heterosexual relationships, when women use power or violence, most of the partners they deal with leave very quickly. So men in our society have really been given permission not to have to deal with anybody who's unhealthy or trying to hurt them in any way or retaliate or do harm. They just go, well, I'm not out of here. I'm not going to live this way. I don't have to live this way. And so we know that. So it's not that you can't be harmed. When I look at research and I look at the research that says, 1 in 7 men, when you actually look at it, there's questions like, has anybody ever thrown a pot at you? Have you ever, has your partner ever pushed you or has your partner ever slapped you? Well, legally that's defined abuse, right? That's inappropriate and it should be. You probably shouldn't be wheeling, pots and pans across the room at your partner. That's not what I'm saying. But what we are talking about, what Diane and I specifically are talking about is power-based violence, where one partner takes control, assumes, and uses tactics to control and manipulate their partner, period, right? And the other partner now is having to change, adapt, change again, adapt constantly, trying to mitigate and navigate out of fear. So there can be a lot of partners who might throw things across the room and neither one of themselves consider themselves victims or perpetrators of anything. There are people that scream and yell and call each other names. I'm not saying that's healthy, but they're not afraid of one another. What Diane and I are talking about when we say IPV, it is a power-based violence where one party is adapting out of fear and mitigating and negotiating with society, with their children, with their friends, their family, and their batter in order to survive what's happening to them. So
I love that you brought
legally
that up.
it's defined different.
Yeah. It wasn't what I was going to jump in, but I really love that you brought that up. I was doing an interview with Russ Funk, who does a lot of men's work. And he goes, one of the difficulties for shelter programs is when a man calls the crisis line. And he goes, Diane, let's just be honest. We probably screen those calls a little tighter when a guy's saying that he's been a victim of domestic violence. But he said, one of the questions that is really good to ask is, how have you changed your behavior based on the violence that has happened in the home. And if they say, well, I really haven't really, then you probably don't have a victim. If they say, well, I've had to do this, this, he goes, here's your indicator. And he goes, and that's really helpful in same-sex couples too, when it can get kind of mucky, and you kind of wonder what's going on. So the only thing though I was going to say back on the other, he's been around for quite a bit, but I do know lots of folks like reading Lundy Bancroft books, and people are sort of talking about resources. And I think Lundy Bancroft has some really good insight on, experiences of children. And I know from some fatality reviews that we've been doing here in Lexington, one of the areas we've really been focused on is children who've witnessed abuse in the family, and then what has happened to them post the fatality. And certainly those are the most egregious cases, but there has been some work in Lexington recently about, making sure that we're reaching out. Like if the police are showing up multiple times at a home, how does the school board know that? And what kinds of supports can we do that? And not just hope it happens, but really put some intention to make sure. And there's been a lot of focus, I think, on, people are familiar with ACEs, but then the PACEs part, right? So what are we doing to kind of build some resiliency, and what are those interventions for kids that have experienced and witnessed violence in the home and in their community? So maybe just not even in the home, but if they're in an unsafe community. So it's a little bit of a new world for me. I've been out here in shelter for a long time and focused a lot on the adults, have some really great youth advocates. So I don't mean to be an expert on it, but I've been sort of thrust in that area recently. And those are just quick things that I would shout out to the group that has been helpful to me in wrapping around supporting our littles.
I don't want to let our time elapse before. This is not an easy question because it's case by case. But if we see this going on and somebody is trapped and we see, escalation, I mean, I would pray about it, definitely. What's the solution? What does God want me to do to help this family that obviously is probably headed on a spiral to a really bad place? What can we do if we're witnessing this kind of stuff, someplace around us? I know there's not just, one answer at all. It's case by case, and to get involved in other people's lives, that's wild. That's just.
Well,
Well,
two
I
things.
think
Go.
Go ahead. Well, one of the
Well,
things to
mine's
do is
yeah.
we're so
You go.
we're so polite. I'm telling you. I would say this. I think what's really important is we talk about it, because survivors need to be in areas where they're hearing the dialogue. Like I'm not sure that we would be, honestly, when I think of talk show hosts, when I think of Oprah Winfrey back in the 80s, were one of the first people actually talking about domestic violence, intimate partner violence, just started to open up. It's what led to shelters growing and funding happening. It was just having the dialogue. So wherever, I need you to know that if you're, whatever community you're in, it needs, survivors are there too. People are there too. If you're a member of a church and you're on church Sunday morning, there are survivors right there that are struggling with IPV that day. It might have taken everything they had to even get to church that day. One of the women I worked with for many years, that the biggest fight she had was going to church. And as a matter of fact, it ended up in, her losing her life over, like, that was her staple in so many ways. So whatever your background is, or whatever audience you have, we have to talk about it, even if we don't know anybody's out there. But if we suspect somebody is, or we know somebody's going through it, then I think it's critically important. Somebody says, what is IPV? It's intimate partner violence. So it's domestic violence, like the newer language. So it's a little more inclusive. It's all intimate partner, anybody that's intimate partners, right? Same dynamic, just a newer language. But if you know or suspect, it's important that you safely confront it without judgment and without telling somebody what they should do. What we need to do is validate this is hard. It's not easy. It's really common. It's 1 in 4 families that are struggling with this. You know, you're not alone. There's help available. Please know people care. You're worthy. You have value. Because every day they're hearing just the opposite message from their partner, right? You're not worthy. You don't have value. Nobody's going to believe you. How dare you talk about it? If you tell anybody, I'll kill you. If you leave, you're going to pay. I'll take the children from you. I'll fight for custody. So that's what's drilled into their head day in and day out. And if we as a community don't give alternate messaging, that is part of the brainwashing trauma that happens to so many survivors. So to not take action, even though it might feel a little icky to get involved in somebody's life, right? It might feel icky. I'm telling you, it saves survivors' lives every day because somebody got icky, because somebody stepped out and said, you should not be treated this way. There's help available. When you are ready for it, when you think you might want to make a different choice than where you're living and doing, I will be here to help connect you to the right resources. I don't need you all to be an expert. I just need you to not shy away from it, if that makes sense. Like, don't shy away from it. Survivors need us to be a voice desperately.
We need a lot more time. We've got 2 more really good questions and we've got 3 minutes. I don't know. How can we do this? Reverend Franklin, Reverend Reed. Anybody want to take up the last 3 minutes?
I have a question, Nadia.
Yes.
Yes.
Actually, can we go to Reverend Franklin and Reverend Reed
Of course,
first,
sorry.
if you don't mind?
Sure.
Or maybe.
I just wanted to,
Thank you.
because of their perspective, I'm so appreciative of what they're saying. Thank you so much, both of you. I really value your perspective on the rise of violence in our communities, and you've addressed domestic violence and intimate partner violence so well. Because I'm very interested in gun violence, I just wanted your take on the rise of gun violence, which is off the charts as well. And I just thought your perspective would be useful and very helpful. Could you share with us your perspectives on that?
Yes.
Well,
Yes. Go ahead. I'll let Diane jump in first.
Well, I won't jump in too much. I was looking at, a few statistics before we popped on because I knew gun violence was certainly a priority for this group. And so, we were looking at how many women, I want to say it was 1 million women in a year had been threatened by a handgun or a gun in their homes. 70 people a month had been killed by a handgun. I also think Darlene and I have been chatting about this a little bit. I think COVID had a bigger impact than many of us realized. I think some people very much realized it, but I think we're also in a real state of COVID kind of returned us a little bit into reclusiveness or a little bit more fear. And I think the escalation, fear and the connection of having firearms in the home for personal safety has now made our families unsafe. And so I think the experience of COVID on people's wellness and mental health with the escalation of weapons in the home is just a terrible, perfect storm in our domestic violence world. So I don't have anything brilliant to say to that, but I would say COVID and guns are escalating, and I can't imagine that there is not that there's not causal there. What were you going to say, Darlene?
80% of homicide victims of intimate partner violence are killed with a gun. So I need guns out of the hands of batterers. I need guns out of the hands of people that we know who is the problem. And unfortunately, we had VAWA, the Violence Against Women Act, who allowed us to remove guns from individuals that were deemed dangerous because of a protective order against them or assault charges, things like that. And now parts of the country are moving away from that. So as an advocate, no matter my personal feelings about Second Amendment, which I won't have a discussion about, I don't need to, but as an advocate for domestic violence, I think we need to work very hard to keep weapons and access to weapons out of the hands of volatile people who we know are abusive. We have a name and a face for it. These are not strangers out here that pop in and do mass shootings, which is terrible enough in our country. These are people we know do harm. We know have held weapons against their partners and their family and have threatened to kill them. So that's my take on gun violence. It's rampant on multitude of levels, but it's extremely dangerous and intimate partner violence.
Okay, so we're over time. Thank you for your awesome questions. We still have 2 more questions. I don't know, do you ladies have a couple more minutes, or we always end on time, so.
That's fine.
can-
And I did add into the chat room when the person was talking about the life coaching, I did put my email out there. Would love to
Yeah.
chat with Daryl about that. So, but we can talk about it as well.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, he just disappeared again, so I don't know. Reverend Franklin, do you want to pipe in, or? Well, there he is.
Yeah, thank you so much, ladies. I really appreciate this conversation because this is a very necessary conversation. And please pardon me, I was not able to be as present as I would have liked to have been because I'm here and doing the laundry in the laundromat here. But you know, I believe that it's I just wondered if there is a public-private partnership with, I guess you can say, landmark education, and you know, you got I guess Mary Morrissey and you know, people from the Proctor Group or some of these life coaches. If these kind of things can be incorporated to be utilized as additional tools, complementing your expertise, if that help program to help address maybe some of the traumas that are related towards, I guess you can say, subconscious or psychological programming that is not easy to unearth or to, you know, or to bring to surface. And if these kind of things are taken to the correctional system, and basically, yeah, that's my question. Does that make sense?
Well, no, and I only say that not because you probably didn't, but you were cutting in and out quite a bit. So I don't know that I quite caught you were asking if there were corporate, like public, private collaborations that could help with those experience trauma.
Right, exactly. Say, for instance, you have, you know, people like Dr. Phil and other different people. There's, you know, very famous life coaches that offer their programs, you know, on the internet. And if there is a way to reach out to some of those individuals who seem to be expertise in identifying some of the psychological or subconscious programming that's associated with these mental disorders, right? And to help complement your expertise. And if there's a way to be able to create a collaboration between those two entities.
Well, I'm all about collaboration. I would love to think about what that would look like, but I find it imperative that we have collaborations on this level if we are going to reduce the rate by which IPV is affecting families, right? Like, I do think it has to be collaborative. I don't know exactly what that would look like. We have collaboratives locally, like with Alltech, which is an international company who also is lending its professional innovation things to our organization, trying to break these cycles. But boy, I would love to envision a world where we had like these far-reaching entities with their level of expertise with ours to really impact. Yeah, I would like to think about that further, but yes, I think this is the only way we're going to end it. And I would like to end it at some point in time. I would like to see the
Yeah.
end of IPV. That's why I've been doing it forever. Yes.
But I think one of the things too that we've always known, but we're really at a place to push, and I think that's why Green Dot resonates so much, is we know that people access help and support in so many different avenues. So it's important for programs like ours that we're not the only messengers to talk about domestic violence. We need the faith communities to talk about domestic violence. We need life coaches and emergency rooms and teachers to be aware of the signs of intimate partner violence, the insidiousness of domestic violence and intimate partner violence, so that we begin to recognize those, what's happening, and that we do talk about it, we do address it, not just for victim, but hopefully also for batterer or potential, person who's causing harm, to try to just change that direction and that behavior as well. So any kind of relationship and partnership, I think, is great. We've always been really saddened, I think, to a degree, of how many attorneys we'll be working with that are family law attorneys and go, I only had 2 hours of domestic violence law in my, when I was going for my law degree, or social workers that will come in and they might get a little domestic violence, but they might not as well. And I can't imagine working with human justice fields and family law and not have a really strong understanding of domestic violence, because it just impacts so many people. So partnerships are great. Life coaching, we've done a lot of life coaching work at Greenhouse 17, but that's been more towards staff and vicarious trauma sort of work. So we like the life coaching model.
Excellent, excellent. Thank you so much for staying on
Thank you.
extra. And everybody, if you want to excuse yourself, go ahead, because we like to stick to our 1 hour. But John, last question. You have to unmute yourself though, if the ladies are willing to stay in.
Yes, thank you, Nadia. My question relates to COVID and how things may have changed because of that. I mean, the shift in your way you do things or way education is taking place, and obviously there's not nearly enough staff and trained people to address the many people that are out there that need help. So I just wonder what might have changed, the internal shift or external shift in the professional level in the field of counseling and getting help for people.
Well, COVID certainly, I'll let Darlene, but COVID was certainly a crazy time for us doing community living and in shelter. It was a scary time. It changed a lot of our process. At one point, we mostly emptied out our shelter program and moved to hotels. How do you give service delivery to residential folks? And it was just a lot. Great partnerships, though, with the health departments and another group that was similar to hospice that would put people that tested positive with COVID into kind of a quarantine hotels. So anyways, what I will say at the end of it all, though, is it made some relationships and partnerships that we didn't have before. Our service delivery has changed a great deal because we're doing a whole lot more Zoom support groups, Zoom emails, advocacy work, which is good and bad. I do think face-to-face can always be great. But as Darlene mentioned in the beginning, we're 17 counties. A chunk of those counties are rural. Transportation is difficult. Childcare can be difficult. It opened up a menu of services where before, let's say I'm in Richmond, Kentucky, and my support group in Richmond, Kentucky was Tuesdays at 2, and that's the only time. Well, now I can select this Zoom group or this Zoom group, and so the openness of other advocacy and groups it just opened up the doors of that. So in some regards, I think COVID forced us to think differently and has engaged us differently. We have a lot of folks that also do crisis calls through Facebook Messenger. We tried to stop that. We didn't like that. We wanted it to come through the crisis line. It's hard to text and find out what's going on with a person. But at the same time, you got to be available to reach out how people are reaching out to you. So I'll stop at that. Darlene might have other things, but I will say, besides the, excuse my language, the hellishness of COVID and navigating all of that, and courts closed, courts open, we did learn some things. And I think in some respects, we do things better, actually.
Yeah,
So
sure. Okay, thank you.
Excellent, excellent. Okay, we need to close. I would like to have everybody unmute and give these two ladies a big round of applause. They are amazing.
Hey,
Appreciate you. Thank you for your
Thank you.
time. We went way
Thank you
over.
all.
Rock and roll, rock and
And-
Rock-
roll, yay.
Good times are rolling, yeah, right.
And we're definitely
you all.
praying for you, and we're gonna use everything that you gave us to help make this place better.
Yeah,
Thank you all so
Thank you.
much.
Together. Thank you all for inviting us.
wonderful, yeah.
Excellent,
Bless.
excellent.
God bless. Thanks.
Thank you, thank you.
Thank you.
Excellent.
Thank you, everybody. Have a wonderful day.
Thank
do the
you.
same.
Franklin.
Thank you so
Thank you,
much.
Nadia.
God bless you
Thank
guys.
you.
Thank
Thank
you,
you,
thank you,
EJ, for
thank you.
staying on extra.
All right.
Really appreciate it.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Have a
Thank you,
great day.
Son, for meeting these wonderful ladies and bringing them to us.
Yes, God bless you.
Thank you, son.
I hope I love to meet you, Darlene and Diane. You
Come visit us. Come visit us sometime.
Yes, I will.
All right. All right. Bye-bye.
At work. Yes, thank you.
Okay. Wonder if EJ is on and close us out.
Close out. Oh, Nadia,
Hi.
where's that Reverend Oliver? He couldn't make it.
I have to find out what country he's in. I don't think he's home yet. I thought he was home, but I tried.
And then Jenkins is not.
Hmm?
Dr. Jenkins come out sometimes, no?
Yeah, he's really crazy right now with his schedule. Anyway, we need Reverend EJ to close us out.
EJ was so everybody out still. Okay.
No, there's a bunch of people here still. Pakistan is here, and Juan and the Wattville family is here. Sacramento, South Pacific Currents are still here. So
Yeah, so not the
can I talk to you later?
yes, sure.
Okay, good.
So much, Nadia.
Thank you very much. That was wonderful.
I have electric out now. No,
No
electric.
electric? Wow.